It happened in Kent not long after 1476. William Caxton had set up his printing press in Westminster. He was printing books in English for English people. This was a new thing. Before, the important books were in Latin or French. But Caxton was a merchant. He knew what people wanted. They wanted stories in their own language. He translated a French book about the fall of Troy and called it the Recueil of the Histories of Troy. It was a success. So he kept translating. One day, he was working on a version of Virgil's Aeneid. He called his version Aeneados. When it was finished, a man named John, came to see him. John told Caxton his English was too complicated. It was full of strange foreign words. He said Caxton should use plain, common English that everyone could understand. Caxton thought about this. He remembered a story. He wrote it down in the preface to his Aeneados. The story was about a group of merchants from London. They were sailing north up the coast. A storm hit. They were forced to land at the mouth of the Thames in Kent. They were hungry. One of the merchants, a man named Sheffield, went to a small house to buy food. He spoke to the woman of the house. He asked her if she had any meat. She said no. Then he asked her for some eggs. The woman did not understand him. She said she could not speak French. Sheffield got angry. He was not speaking French. He was speaking English. He asked for eggs. The woman had no idea what he meant. Another merchant, one who understood the local Kentish dialect, stepped in. He told Sheffield to ask for eyren. Sheffield asked the woman for eyren. She understood immediately. She brought him what he wanted. Caxton used this story to make a point. What was the right word? Sheffield, a man from the north of England, used the word eggs. The woman in the south used the word eyren. The northern word came from the Vikings. Their word was egg. The southern word was the old one. It came from Old English, from the Anglo-Saxons. Their word was a, and the plural was eyren. For hundreds of years, both words existed in England. You could travel 100 miles and find people using a completely different word for the same thing. But one word was winning. In the 1380s, about a century before Caxton's merchants got lost in Kent, a writer named Geoffrey Chaucer was working on his Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was a Londoner, but his English was a mix of everything. You know, he used the northern word. He wrote about a poor widow who had a rooster, Chanticleer. He did not write that she had eyren in her dairy. He wrote that she had and cheese, but when he needed a plural, he chose the Viking way. He wrote about a priest who dreamed of feasting on roasted eggs. By the time Caxton printed his books, the battle was almost over. The Viking word was simpler. Egg, eggs. The Old English word was more complicated. Eyren. The printing press helped kill the old word. Printers had to choose one spelling, one word. They spread the language of London and the universities. And that language had absorbed a huge number of words from the north, from the Danelaw, from the men who came in longships. The woman in Kent lost. Sheffield won. We do not eat eyren today. We eat eggs. We just took the word. We stole it from the Vikings, and it was not the only one. Number 10. A tool can be a weapon, but a name is always a name. His name was Ulf. It meant wolf. He was 12 years old in the year 879. His home was not a village in Denmark. It was a farmstead a day's walk from the city. The English called Eoforwick. His father called it Jorvik. A year before, a great Viking army had settled this land. They were done with raiding. There were farmers now. Ulf's father, Gunnar, had been given a plot of land. It had a small house, a field for barley, and a pasture for their 2 cows. The English family who lived there before were gone. Gunnar did not talk about them. The house was theirs now. It was made of wood and wattle and daub, with a thatched roof. It was smaller than the longhouses Ulf remembered from his childhood in Ribe. It was different, but it was home. One morning, Gunnar took Ulf to the small shed where he kept his tools. The shed smelled of wood smoke and old iron. Gunnar reached into a leather pouch. He pulled out a small knife. The handle was made of deer antler, polished smooth from use. The blade was about 4 inches long, thick at the spine and tapering to a sharp point. It was dark gray, almost black, the color of forged iron. It was not a weapon. It was not a scramasax for fighting. It was a tool. Gunnar held it out to Ulf. "This is your Nifr," he said in Old Norse. The word felt heavy and important. A Nifr. Ulf took it. The weight was good in his hand. The antler was cool and solid. He had seen his father use his own knife for every day. He used it to cut bread and cheese at the table. He used it to mend leather straps for the plow. He used it to carve small wooden animals for Ulf's little sister, Freya. A Nifr was part of being a man. It meant you could work, you could provide, you could fix what was broken. You keep it sharp, Gunnar said. You keep it clean. You do not lose it. It is for work, not for play. Ulf nodded. He slid the knife into a small leather sheath his mother had made for him. It hung from his belt. He felt taller. A few weeks later, Ulf was down by the river, trying to catch fish with a small spear. He saw another boy on the far bank. The boy was about his age. He had fair hair, like Ulf, but his clothes were different. He wore a simple brown tunic, patched at the elbows. He was an English boy. His name was Edwin. Edwin's family had not left. They lived on a neighboring farm. They had been tenants of an English lord. Now they were tenants of the new Viking lord. They paid their rent to a jarl in Jorvik. At first, the English family stayed away from the newcomers. They were afraid. But the children were curious. Edwin shouted something. Ulf did not understand all the words. The boy's language was similar to his own, but different. It was like hearing someone speak with a mouth full of pebbles. Ulf shouted back in Norse. Edwin looked just as confused. Edwin pointed at the knife on Ulf's belt. He pulled one from his own belt. His was similar, but the blade was a little wider. He held it up. He said a word. Seeks, he said. Ulf shook his head. He pulled his own knife from its sheath. Nifr, he said, tapping the blade with his finger. Edwin repeated the word. Nifr. It sounded strange coming from his mouth. He said his own word again. Seeks. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. They did not need many words. They pointed, they made gestures, they skipped flat stones across the water. They became friends. Over the next few years, Ulf and Edwin spent a lot of time together. They learned each other's words. As Ulf learned that the English word for house was hus. In Norse, it was also hus. That was easy. He learned the word for cow was Q. In Norse, it was Kyr. Close enough. But some words were completely different, and some words were better. The Old English word for a small, single-edged blade was seeks. It was a good word, but it was also the word for a much larger fighting knife, almost a short sword. The Saxons were named after it. The word was confusing. Did you mean the small tool in your belt, or the weapon you carried into battle? The Norse word nefur was specific. It meant the tool, the everyday blade. When Ulf and Edwin were working together, mending a fence or skinning a rabbit, it was easier to use the Norse word. There was no confusion. Pass me the knifer. Edwin started using it. Then his father started using it. It was just a clear word. The thing about the Vikings in England, the ones who settled in the Danelaw, is that they were not just a conquering army. They were a whole people. They brought their families, their laws, their gods, and their language. And their language was not so different from Old English. They were both Germanic languages. They shared a common ancestor. An Englishman and a Dane could probably have a broken conversation and get the general idea of what the other was saying. This made it very easy for words to cross over. It was not like French, which was imposed from the top down by the Norman conquerors 200 years later. The Norse words spread from the ground up. They were spoken in the fields, in the markets, in the houses, where Danish farmers and English farmers lived side by side. Words are tools. People use the best tool for the job. Nifar was a better tool than Seeks for describing an everyday knife. It was more precise. It did not have the baggage of being the name for a weapon or a people, so people started using it. By the 11th century, the word was showing up in English texts spelled sniff. The key was pronounced at the time. Over the centuries, the pronunciation changed. The k fell silent, but the word stayed. It was a perfect piece of linguistic theft. It was simple, useful, and better than what the English had before. Ulf grew up. He inherited his father's farm. He married an English woman. His children spoke a language that was a mix of their father's Norse and their mother's English. When he gave his own son his first knife, a small tool with a handle carved from ash wood, he did not have to think about what to call it. There was only one word for it. The word was knife. Number 9, your house defines your freedom. Astrid was born in the year 902 in Lincolnshire. Her father was a Danish farmer named Ketil. Her mother, Edith, was English. This was common in the Danelaw. The first wave of Viking settlers had been mostly men, soldiers from the Great Heathen Army. They took wives from the local population. By Astrid's time, the two peoples had been living together for a generation. The lines were blurring. Astrid grew up speaking a blend of two languages. At home, her father spoke Norse, her mother spoke her dialect of Old English, and they understood each other perfectly. The children picked up both. It was normal. When Astrid was 17, a man named Orm came to ask for her hand in marriage. Orm was a good match. He was older, maybe 30. He had served with the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in his youth. He had come to England with the army and had been granted a large piece of land. He was a wealthy man. He owned his farm outright. He was not a tenant, he was a freeholder. Ketil agreed to the marriage. Astrid was nervous, but she knew it was her duty. Orm was a respected man in the community. She moved to Orm's farm. It was much larger than her father's. There was a big farmhouse, several barns and fields that stretched all the way to the river. Orm had 3 English families who worked for him, living in small cottages on his land. On her first day at the farm, Orm took her by the arm and led her to the door of the main house. He stopped on the threshold. He looked at her. He was a tall man with a thick gray streaked beard. His eyes were a very pale blue. "You are the lady of this house now," he said in Norse. "You are its keeper." Then he used a word she knew, but had never really thought about. He introduced her to his chief farmhand, an Englishman named Leofwine. He pointed to himself and said, "I am the husbóndi." And then he pointed to her, "And you are the husfreyja, húsbóndi." The word was made of 2 parts, hús meaning houses, and bóndi meaning a dweller or tiller of the soil. A bóndi was a free farmer, a man who owned his land. The word was a statement of status. It meant master of the house. It meant he was in charge not just of the building, but of the land, the people, the entire estate. The English had a word for a married man. It was seorl, or sometimes wer. A seorl was a freeman, but the word was also used for a peasant. It did not have the same strong sense of ownership and authority that husbandi did. The Old English word for the head of a family was laford, which would later become lord. But that was a word for a nobleman. Orm was not a high-born lord. He was a farmer, a very successful farmer. Húsbóndi was the perfect word for him. It defined his place in the world. He was a master of his own domain. Astrid learned quickly what it meant to be the husfreyja, the lady of the house. She managed the household. She was in charge of the food stores, the weaving, the dairy. She carried a ring of keys on her belt for all the storehouses and chests. This was a Viking custom. The keys were a visible sign of her authority. The English women who worked in the kitchen looked at her with a mixture of respect and fear. The word husbandi began to spread. The English farmers who worked for men like Orm heard it every day. They started to use it. It was a powerful word. It described the new social order in the Danelaw. The land was now owned by these Danish freeholders. They were the masters. The interesting thing about the word bóndi is its root. It comes from the Old Norse verb búa, which means to live or to dwell. A bóndi was simply a dweller. But because land ownership was so central to the life of a Viking freeman, the word came to mean a landowner, a man of a certain standing. So husbandi was not just man of the house, it was the man who dwells in and owns this house and land. It was a legal and social status wrapped up in a single word. The Old English seorl just could not compete. By the 13th century, long after the cultural distinctions between Dane and Saxon had faded in the north of England, the word appeared in written English as husbande. Its meaning had shifted slightly. It no longer specifically meant a landowner. It had come to mean any married man, the head of a household. And it had completely pushed out the old words. The change happened because the Vikings did not just bring a new language. They brought a new way of thinking about society. In many parts of England, the Anglo-Saxon social structure was very hierarchical, with a few great lords and a mass of peasants who worked the land but did not own it. In the Danelaw, there was a large and powerful class of free farmers, the bondar. They were the backbone of their society. They answered to the jarl and the king, but they were their own masters. The word husband is a legacy of that social structure. It carries a faint echo of a time when owning your own house and land was the definition of being a free man. It is a word about property, power, and place. Astrid lived with Orm for 40 years. They had 6 children. She ran the household with a firm but fair hand. She outlived him by a decade. When she died, she was buried next to him in the small churchyard under a stone carved with a mix of Christian crosses and Norse patterns. She was remembered as a strong husfreyja. The word she used to describe her husband, the word that defined his role in her own, had already begun its journey to becoming a simple, everyday English word. It was a quiet theft, a word borrowed from a new neighbor that so perfectly described a new reality that the old word was simply forgotten. Number 8. A hole in the wall can let in light or a killer. The year is 954. The last Viking king of Jorvik, Eric Bloodaxe, has just been driven out and killed. Northumbria is now firmly under the control of the English king Edred, but the city of Jorvik, modern-day York, is still a Viking city. The street names are Norse Coppergate, Skeldergate. The people are a mix of English and Scandinavian. The language they speak is a Creole, a mishmash of Old English and Old Norse. In a small, crowded house on a street near the river Ouse, a man named Bjarni is working. Bjarni is a carpenter. He is known for his skill with an axe and an adze. He is building a new house for a wealthy merchant. The merchant, a Dane named Halfdan, wants a fine house better than his neighbors. The house is built in the Scandinavian style. It is a long, narrow, timber-framed building. The walls are made of planks fitted together, with wattle and daub to fill the gaps. The roof is thatched with reeds from the riverbank. It is dark inside. The only light comes from the open doorway and a smoke hole in the center of the roof. When the doors close against the cold, the only light is from the central hearth fire, which fills the room with smoke. The English houses are much the same. They are dark, smoky, and damp. An Anglo-Saxon might call an opening in the wall an eagthorel. This means eye hole. It is a very literal word, a hole that you look through, but these are not common. And openings in the wall let in wind, rain, and enemies. A house is a fortress. You keep it sealed up tight. Halfdan, the merchant, has traveled. He has been to Hedeby in Denmark, to Kaupang in Norway. He has seen the houses of rich jarls. He wants something more. He tells Bjarni he wants more light in his great hall. Bjarni is a practical man. He thinks about the problem. A hole in the wall is a weakness, but it is the only way to let in light. He thinks about the wind. The prevailing wind in Jorvik comes from the west. He will put the opening on the east wall in the lee of the wind. He takes his axe and carefully cuts a rectangular hole in the wooden wall. It is not large, perhaps the size of a man's head. It is high up, near the roofline, so no one can easily climb through. He carves the edges smooth. Light streams into the dusty, smoky room, a bright spear of daylight that illuminates the swirling dust motes. Halfdan is pleased. He asks Bjarni what he calls this new thing. Bjarni thinks for a moment. He uses the Norse word. He calls it a vindauga. The word is a poem. Vindr means wind. Auga means a wind eye, an eye for the wind to look through. It is a much more evocative word than the plain English eye hole. It acknowledges the danger, the wildness of the outside world that can now peer into the house. An eye is a two-way thing. You look out, but the world and the wind looks in. Halfdan loves the word. In Dauga, he shows his new wind eye to his friends. The idea catches on. Other wealthy merchants in Jorvik want Vindauga in their houses. It is a status symbol. It shows you are wealthy enough to afford a house that is not just a simple shelter. It shows you are not afraid of the outside world. At first, these wind eyes are just open holes. To close them, you would have a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled animal skin that could be fixed over the opening. This glass is incredibly rare and expensive, known only to the church and the greatest kings. The English neighbors see these new openings. They hear the word the Danes use for them, vindauga. It is a better word than eggthorel. It is more memorable. And it is attached to a new and desirable piece of technology. So they start to use it. The journey of Vindauga into English is a great example of how technology and language are linked. When a new invention or idea is introduced by a different culture, the word for that invention often comes with it. The Vikings brought a new architectural feature, and they brought the name for it. The pronunciation changed over time. The viv sound at the beginning was often pronounced as woo in northern English dialects. Vindauga became windaga. And the G sound at the end was softened and eventually dropped. The two parts of the word fused together. By the year 1200, it was appearing in texts as windogy. A few decades later, it was window. By the 14th century, the Old English eiren was completely gone. It only survives in one manuscript. No one said eye hole anymore. Everyone from the king in London to the farmer in Yorkshire said window. They had forgotten that the word was not originally theirs. It is a strange thought. Every time we look out a window, we are using a Viking word. We are using a miniature poem about a wind eye, an opening cut into a smoky wall in a city like Jorvik over 1,000 years ago by a man who wanted a little more light in his life. The Vikings had a reputation for bringing darkness and destruction, but they also brought the word for letting in the light. Number 7, sometimes the clearest words are not your own. The market in Lincoln in the year 975 was a loud, confusing place. The city was one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, a major center of Viking power and trade. You could hear a dozen languages and dialects in the street. Merchants from Norway sold furs. Farmers from the local countryside sold grain and livestock. A silversmith hammered out a delicate bracelet. An English woman argued with a Danish butcher over the price of pork. In the middle of this chaos stood a man named Elfric. He was a reeve, a local official responsible for collecting taxes for the English king, Edgar the Peaceful. His job required him to talk to everyone, and it was a nightmare. The problem was pronouns. Elfric would be trying to sort out a dispute. A farmer claimed that his neighbors had let their pigs wander into his field and ruin his crops. Elfric would ask, "Who are they?" The farmer would point at the neighbors, a man and his 2 sons. He would use the Old English pronoun for they high. So he would say, "He ruined my barley." The problem was that high sounded almost exactly like the word for he. It also sounded a lot like hio, the word for she. In the heat of an argument, with accents thick and tempers high, it was very easy to get confused. Did he mean the man's wife? The whole group of them? It got worse. The Old English word for there was hurrah. The word for them was him. Again, hiera sounded like higher, the word for hair, and him was exactly the same as the word for him, the singular. So a sentence like, "I gave him their tools" could sound like I gave him his tools, or even I gave her their tools. It was a mess. Elfric spent half his day asking people to clarify. Do you mean him, the man, or them, the group? The Danes and Norwegians in the market did not have this problem. Their pronouns were clear and distinct. Their word for they was there. Their word for they was thera. Their word for them was the him. These words started with ot sound. They were impossible to confuse with the hush words for he, she, and her. When a Viking trader said, "There sold me bad wool," everyone knew he meant a group of people. When he said, "I paid them yesterday," it was clear he was not talking about a single man. Elfric, out of sheer frustration, started using the Norse pronouns himself. When he was questioning witnesses, he would adopt the Viking words to avoid confusion. "Did you see there in the field?" he would ask. "Are these there pigs?" People understood immediately. There was no ambiguity. This was not a case of a word being more poetic or describing a new technology. This was a case of linguistic emergency repair. Old English had a serious flaw. Its third-person plural pronouns were a recipe for confusion. Old Norse provided a simple, elegant solution. The people of the Danelaw living and working together naturally drifted towards the clearer option. The English people started using their, them and thera. At first, it was just in speech. It was the common practical language of the street and the farm. The scribes and monks who wrote the official documents in Old English stuck to the proper words, hi, hira, him. But the spoken language always wins in the end. After the Norman conquest in 1066, the official written language of England became French and Latin. Old English was no longer the language of the court. It was just the language of the common people. And the common people, especially in the north and east, where the Viking influence was strongest, were using the Norse pronouns. When English began to re-emerge as a written language in the 12th and 13th centuries, it had changed. The writers wrote down the language as it was spoken, and so the Norse pronouns appeared on the page. There became they, there became there, thame became them. They did not replace the Old English words entirely at first. For a while, some dialects used a mix. They might use the Norse they, but the Old English hem for them. The Chaucer, writing in London in the late 14th century, uses they, but he often uses here for their and hem for them. But the clarity of the full Norse set was undeniable. By the 1500s, the battle was over. The Old English pronouns were extinct. This is perhaps the most profound theft of all. We did not just steal a word for a tool or a house. We stole a fundamental part of our grammar. The words we use 100 times a day to talk about other people are not originally English. They are a gift or a theft from the Vikings. Every time you say they, them, or their, you are using a word that a frustrated official like Elfric might have picked up in a noisy market in Lincoln simply because it was a better tool for the job. It is a reminder that languages are not pure. They are practical, messy, and constantly evolving. They take what they need from wherever they can find it. And in the case of our most common plural pronoun, English needed help, and the Vikings provided it. Number 6, a law is just a thing laid down. The year is 991. The place is a field near the town of Malden in Essex. A fleet of Viking raiders, led by a man named Olaf Tryggvason, has landed. They are demanding tribute from the local English lord, an old ealdorman named Byrhtnoth. Byrhtnoth refuses. He gathers his army, his household troops, and the local militia, and marches to meet them. The Vikings are on an island in the river connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Byrhtnoth's men hold the causeway. The Vikings cannot cross. A Viking messenger shouts across the water. He tells Byrhtnoth that they are sailors and they want a quick fight. He asks Byrhtnoth to let them cross the causeway and fight on open ground. In an act of incredible foolish pride, Byrhtnoth agrees. His men fall back. The Vikings cross the river. The battle that follows is a disaster for the English. Byrhtnoth is killed, his army is defeated. The story of the battle is immortalized in a famous Old English poem. This event marked the beginning of a new wave of Viking attacks on England. These were not the raids of a century before, which led to settlement. This was organized extortion. The English king, Aethelred the Unready, began a policy of paying the Vikings to leave. This tribute was called the Danegeld. It was a massive tax on the English people. To collect this tax and to govern the kingdom in general, Aethelred and his advisors had to issue decrees. They had to create rules. The Old English word for a rule or a decree was dom. This is the root of our word doom, which originally just meant judgment. Another word was ae, which meant a divine or customary law. But in the north and east of England, in the Danelaw, people had been using a different word for 100 years. They used the Old Norse word lagu. Lagu comes from a root that means to lay down. So a lagu was literally something, which is laid down. It was a fixed, established rule. The plural was log, our word law. This Norse concept of law was slightly different from the English one. It was less about a king's judgment dom or ancient custom ae. It was more of a social contract, a set of rules that free men agreed upon in an assembly, a thing. It was a collective agreement. The Danelaw was called the Danelaw because it was the part of England where the Lagu of the Danes was in force. When you crossed from English, Mercia, into the Danelaw, you were under a different legal system. The fines for crimes were different. The methods of proving innocence were different. For more than a century, these two legal systems and two sets of words existed side by side in England. But the Norse word had a kind of directness and simplicity that was powerful. A lagu is a thing laid down. It is clear, it is solid. When King Nut the Great, a Dane, became king of all England in 1016, he unified the country. He was a great lawmaker. He issued a comprehensive legal code for the whole kingdom. And he used the Norse word. He did not talk about his doms. He talked about his lagu. Nut's reign helped to cement the Norse word law as the primary term for a legal rule in England. He was a Danish king ruling over a mixed population of English and Danes. He used the language that was common in the most heavily Scandinavian parts of his kingdom. His use of the word gave it royal authority. After the Norman conquest, the new French-speaking rulers brought their own legal language. So we still have many French legal terms in English today: judge, jury, evidence, verdict. But the most basic, fundamental word for the entire concept remained the simple, powerful word the Vikings had brought with them. the word law. The Old English words faded away. Dom narrowed its meaning to judgment or fate, usually a bad one, which is how we get doomsday. EAE disappeared completely. The theft of the word law tells a story about power. First, the power of the Viking settlers to establish their own legal system in a large part of England. Then the power of a Danish king, Knut, to make his ancestral language the language of government for the entire country. It also shows a subtle shift in thinking. The law was no longer just the king's judgment. It was a set of established rules, things laid down for all to see. The word itself suggests a more formal, codified system. The Viking love of order and clear rules, which seems at odds with their reputation as chaotic raiders, is baked into the very word we use for the rules that govern us. Every time we talk about breaking the law or upholding the law, we are using a word that was shouted across a river by raiders and later written into the king's code by a Danish conqueror. Number 5. Fear can curdle into ugliness. Her name was Gyda. She lived in a small village in the East Riding of Yorkshire around the year 1000. The village was mostly English, but a few families like hers were descended from Danish settlers. She had a daughter named Thora. Thora was a quiet child. When she was 5, she fell into the hearth fire. Gyda pulled her out, screaming. The left side of the child's face was badly burned. She survived, but the skin healed into a tight, disfigured scar. It pulled the corner of her eye and her mouth downwards. As Thora grew up, the other children were cruel. They had a word for her. They called her Ugliger. The word came from Old Norse. It was made of 2 parts. The first part was UGR. This word meant fear or dread. The second part was ligger, which is like our suffixly or like. So Ugliger meant fair, like, or dread-inducing. When a Viking warrior described an enemy army as Ugliger, he meant they were fearsome, formidable, inspiring dread. It was a word of respect, in a way. It was the kind of word you would use to describe a dragon or a powerful jarl. It was not about appearance, it was about the feeling the thing produced in you. But in the mouths of the village children, the word began to change. When they looked at Thora's scarred face, they felt a flicker of fear, or perhaps revulsion. Her face was not normal. It was unsettling. So they used the word they had for things that cause fear. They called her Ugliger. The word was not a direct comment on her beauty or lack of it. It was a comment on the reaction she caused in them. They were in a way blaming her for their own feelings. Gyda heard them. It broke her heart. She held Thora close and told her not to listen. But the word stuck. Thora was the Ugliger girl. This is how the meaning of words can drift. A word that once meant fearsome or dreadful was slowly being repurposed. It started to be used for things that were not just scary but visually displeasing. A gnarled tree could be Ugliger. A deformed animal could be Ugliger. A person with a scarred face could be Ugliger. The original Old English word for the opposite of beautiful was unfager, which literally means unfair or unlovely. It was a straightforward word, but Ugliger had a special kind of power. It had a bite to it. The harsh sounds in the middle made it sound harsh, guttural. It sounded like the thing it was describing. The word entered the English language in the north, where the Viking influence was strongest. By the 13th century, it appears in writing as uglike or ugly. By this point, its meaning had completed its journey. It no longer meant fearsome, it meant repulsive to the sight of unpleasant or forbidding appearance. The old meaning connected to fear did not vanish entirely. We can still see a trace of it in the fairy tale of the ugly duckling. The other ducks are not just put off by his appearance, they are hostile to him. His ugliness provokes an aggressive reaction. He is an outsider to be feared and driven away. The story of the word ugly is a sad one. It is about how we as humans react to things that are different. We react with fear, and we turn that fear into a judgment. We take a word that describes our own feeling, dread-inducing, and we project it onto the person or thing that causes it. We label them with our own fear. Thora grew up with that label. She learned to live with it. She became a skilled weaver, her hands creating beautiful patterns on the loom. People in the village came to respect her for her work. They still thought of her as the ugly girl, but they also knew her as the best weaver in the district. The word they used for her, a word brought over from Scandinavia, had found a new home in English. It was a cruel word, a powerful word, and it filled a space in the language that the old, gentler Unfeger could not. We stole the word ugly from the Vikings, but we were the ones who twisted its meaning from something inspiring fear to something that was just unpleasant to look at. Number 4, a crooked path is the wrong path. Magnus was a traitor. He was born in Dublin, which was a great Viking city, in the year 930. He captained a small ship, a Nar, designed for cargo. He sailed the routes around the Irish Sea, trading wine from France and slaves from Ireland for English wool and silver. One year, he sailed to the English port of Chester. He had a cargo of fine Irish linen. He made a deal with an English merchant named Ordgar. Ordgar would buy the entire cargo. The price was agreed 20 pounds of silver. Magnus unloaded the linen. Ordgar's men carried it to his warehouse. Ordgar told Magnus to come back the next day for his payment. When Magnus returned, Ordgar presented him with the silver. Magnus was an experienced trader. He carried a small set of scales with him. He weighed the silver. It was only 18 pounds. Magnus confronted Ordgar. "This is not the full amount," he said, his Norse accent thick. Ordgar shrugged. "The linen was not of the quality you promised. Some of it was damp. I have adjusted the price." This was a lie. The linen was perfect. Magnus was furious. He felt cheated. He had no real recourse. Ordgar was a powerful man in Chester. The local reeve was his cousin. Magnus was a foreigner. He had to accept the lower price or risk losing everything. As he walked back to his ship, short 2 pounds of silver, he muttered a word to himself, Vranger. The word in Old Norse was Vranger. It meant crooked, twisted, or awry. You could use it to describe a piece of wood that was not straight. You could use it for a ship that was blown off course. It was a physical description of something that had deviated from the correct line. But it also had a moral meaning. A person who was dishonest was Vranger. A deal that was unfair was Vranger. An injustice was Vranger. The word used the physical metaphor of crookedness to describe a moral failing. A person who did something wrong had deviated from the straight path of what was right. The English had a word for this concept. They would say, Ordgar's actions were unright. This means unright. It is a good word, very clear. It is the opposite of right. But Vranger was different. It was more visceral. You could picture it. The straight line of a fair deal had been bent, twisted. The image was powerful. Magnus and his sailors used the word as they sailed away from Chester. They cursed Ordgar and his Vranger dealings. When they told the story in other ports, in Dublin and Jorvik, they used that word. The word spread, especially in the north of England where Norse was widely spoken. People liked the feel of it. It had a satisfying snarl to it. To say something was Vranger felt more condemnatory than just saying it was unright. The word slipped into the English language. It first appears in writing around the year 1200 as rang. Later, it became wrong. It did not completely replace the Old English word unright. We still have unrighteousness. But for the simple everyday concept of something being incorrect or immoral, wrong, became the dominant word. We see this same physical metaphor in our own language today, though we may not think about it. We talk about a crooked politician. We say someone is not. On the level, we tell our children to walk the straight and narrow path. These are all echoes of the same idea embedded in the Old Norse word that rightness is straight and wrongness is crooked. The Vikings brought this powerful metaphor with them and gave us the word for it. It was a better word. It had more imagery, more punch. The English heard it, liked it, and stole it. The journey of the word wrong from a ship's deck to the heart of our moral vocabulary is a story about the power of a good metaphor. Sometimes the best way to understand an abstract concept like injustice is to think of it as something physical, something bent out of shape. Magnus the traitor, cheated out of 2 pounds of silver in a port on the Irish Sea, used a word that so perfectly captured his anger and the injustice of his situation that it has stayed with us for over 1,000 years. Number 3, searching a house is not the same as destroying it. It was the summer of 793. Kettle was 18 years old. It was his first time going a Viking, the summer raiding trip that was a rite of passage for young men in his village in western Norway. He was on a longship with 40 other men, including his uncle Bjorn, who was the captain. They had been at sea for 2 days. Then They saw it. A low, sandy island off the coast of the English kingdom of Northumbria. On the island were stone buildings. Or monastery, Lindisfarne. Bjorn had heard stories about this place. He had been told it was full of treasure, unguarded. The monks who lived there were men of peace. They had no weapons. They beached the longship on the sand. The men leaped out, roaring, brandishing axes and swords. The few monks who were outside fled in terror. Catil's heart was pounding. This was it. The raiders stormed into the main church. They tore the golden cross from the altar and ripped the jeweled covers from the holy books. They found silver chalices and plates. They killed the monks who resisted. After they had looted the church, Bjorn gave another order. He pointed to the other buildings on the island, the dormitories, the kitchens, the workshops. He used a specific term. He told his men to ransaka the houses. The word was a compound. Ran meant house. Saka meant to seek or to search. So ransaka literally meant to search a house. It was a legal term back in Norway. If a man was suspected of a crime, the local chieftain could get the authority to ransaka his home to search it for stolen goods or evidence. It was a methodical, purposeful search. This is what Bjorn wanted his men to do. He did not want them to burn the buildings down, not yet. He wanted them to search for any hidden valuables. They were to go through every room, every chest, every cupboard. They were to look for hidden compartments in the floor or walls. It was a systematic plundering. Catil and two other men went into a small building that seemed to be a workshop. It smelled of ink and drying parchment. There were desks and stools. They overturned the desks. They broke open a locked wooden chest. It was full of books. They were worthless to the Vikings, but they threw them aside looking for anything made of metal. And Catil found a small silver ink pot hidden under a loose floorboard. He grinned and put it in his pouch. This was what it meant to ransaka. It was not mindless vandalism. It was a goal-oriented, efficient process of finding and taking everything of value. The raid on Lindisfarne was a profound shock to the Christian world. It was the beginning of the Viking Age in England. The chroniclers wrote of the heathen men who destroyed God's church, slew the priests, and plundered all. The English who witnessed or heard about these raids needed a word for what the Vikings did. They saw them going from house to house, from church to church, taking everything. They heard the Vikings themselves use the word ransaka. The word entered the English consciousness as a term for this specific type of Viking activity. It was not just to steal, it was to plunder a place thoroughly. The word appears in English documents a few centuries later, spelled ransake. Its meaning was fixed. It meant to search a place with the intent to steal, and often with a great deal of violence and destruction in the process. Over time, the meaning broadened slightly. You could ransack a room looking for a lost object, even if you did not intend to steal anything. But the core idea of a thorough, often chaotic, search remained. The violence of its origins still clings to the word. To say a burglar ransacked a house implies much more violation than just saying he searched it. The story of ransack is a direct look into the methodology of the Vikings. They were not just berserkers, crazed killers. They were often disciplined and organized. A raid was a business venture. So the goal was to acquire wealth as efficiently as possible. The process of ransaka was central to that business model. We stole the word from them because we needed a name for the terrible new thing they were doing to us. We took their own technical term for it and turned it into a word of violation and fear. Every time we use the word ransack, we are unconsciously recalling the terror of a monk on Lindisfarne watching a Norwegian teenager like Catil methodically tear his world apart, looking for silver. Number 2, the bear shirt is not a piece of clothing. His name was Svein. He was one of the Jomsvikings, a legendary brotherhood of elite Viking mercenaries who lived in a fortress on the Baltic coast. The year was 986. Svein was fighting in the great naval battle of Drongavag, or a clash between the Jomsvikings and the forces of Hakon, the pagan ruler of Norway. Svein was a formidable warrior. He was huge, with arms as thick as tree branches, but he was known for something else. In the heat of battle, he would sometimes enter a strange state. His eyes would glaze over. He would start to foam at the mouth and chew on the edge of his shield. He would howl like a wolf or growl like a bear. In this state, he felt no pain. He seemed to have superhuman strength. He would cast aside his shield and his mail shirt and charge into the enemy ranks wearing only his trousers, roaring his defiance. He would swing his great two-handed axe in wide, unstoppable arcs, cutting down men as if they were saplings. His own men knew to stay out of his way. In his frenzy, he could not tell friend from foe. He was a berserker. The origin of the word is debated. It could come from berserker, which means bear shirt. This might mean that these warriors wore shirts made of bear skin into battle to take on the strength and ferocity of the animal. Or it could be a metaphorical name, meaning they were as strong as a bear. Another theory is that it comes from berserker, which means bar shirt. This would refer to the practice of fighting without armor in a state of wild abandon, like Svein did. Whatever the origin, the meaning was clear to any Viking. A berserker was a champion warrior who fought with a terrifying, ecstatic fury. They were the special forces of the Viking world, the shock troops. Some sagas say they could blunt enemy weapons with their gaze, that they were immune to fire and iron. They were touched by the god Odin, the god of battle and fury. In the Battle of Hjörungavágr, Svein and his fellow berserkers led the Jomsviking attack. They leaped from their own ships onto the decks of Hakon's fleet, creating chaos and terror. For a while, it seemed they would win the day through sheer ferocity. The English had encountered these warriors before. They had no equivalent. They had brave soldiers, of course. But they had nothing like this seemingly supernatural, uncontrollable rage. They watched in horror as these men, seemingly possessed, tore through their shield walls. They needed a word for these men and for the state they entered, so they borrowed the Norse one. They started to talk about the berserks. The word came into English carrying all the fear and awe of the battlefield. It was a specific noun for a specific type of Viking warrior. For centuries, that is what it remained. It was a historical term. You would read about berserkers in old stories. But in the 19th century, writers like Sir Walter Scott, who were fascinated by the romantic, wild history of the Vikings, began to use the word in a new way. They started to use berserk as an adjective. A character in one of their novels might go berserk. This new usage caught on. The word was too good to be confined to history books. It perfectly described a state of wild, uncontrollable rage. The link to the Viking warrior faded into the background. Anyone could go berserk. A frustrated person stuck in traffic could go berserk. An angry crowd could go berserk. The word was so useful that it also became an adverb. You could run berserk through the streets. This is a fascinating piece of linguistic theft. We took a very specific noun, a job title almost, from 1,000 years ago. We stripped it of its historical context, its connection to Odin and bearskins, and we turned it into a common adjective and adverb to describe a state of mind. The transformation was complete. The memory of Svein, the Jomsviking chewing on a shield in a Norwegian fjord, is gone. But the word that described him is now used by millions of people who have never heard of the Battle of Hjörungavágr. It is a powerful, explosive word, and every time we use it, we are channeling the terrifying, ecstatic fury of the most feared warriors of the Viking Age. Number 1. The clouds became the whole sky. Leif was a farmer in Northumbria in the late 9th century. His grandfather had come to England with the great heathen army. His family had been farming the same plot of land for 2 generations. His neighbors were English. They had been farming their land for 20 generations. They got along well enough. They had to. They shared the same weather, the same struggles against drought and flood. One afternoon, Leif was standing with his neighbor, a man named Cuthbert. They were looking at the sky, trying to decide if it was going to rain on the freshly cut hay. Well, Cuthbert pointed upwards with his chin. The Híofan looks dark over the hills, he said in his Old English dialect. Híofan, this was the English word for the sky. It was also their word for the dwelling place of God. It was the heavens. It was a word with a lot of religious and cosmic meaning. Leif looked up, he nodded, and he used his own word. He pointed to the dark massing clouds in the west. Sky, he said. The Old Norse word sky originally meant cloud. It was related to the Old English word CEO, which also meant cloud. Both came from an ancient Germanic root that meant toe cover or toe shield. A cloud was a covering for the sky, but in Scandinavia the meaning of sky had started to shift. People had begun to use the word for the clouds to refer to the entire expanse above them. The part had come to stand for the whole. It was a very practical, down-to-earth way of looking at things. When you look up, What do you see? You see clouds, so you call the whole thing cloud. In England, this had not happened. And the English had their grand theological word, heophon, and their practical word for the things that floated in it, wolsen, which is the ancestor of the now poetic word welkin. So Leif and Cuthbert stood in their field, using two different words for the same thing. Cuthbert used a word that meant heaven. Leif used a word that meant cloud. This small difference shows a different way of seeing the world. The Anglo-Saxon Christian view was often focused on the spiritual, the divine. The sky was God's home. The Norse pagan view was often more grounded in the physical world. The sky was the place where the clouds were. As Danes and English lived together in the Danelaw, their words began to mix. The English farmers heard their Norse neighbors using sky all the time. It was a short, sharp, simple word. It was easy to say, and perhaps its practical, non-religious meaning was appealing. You could talk about the sky without having to think about God and the angels. You could just talk about the weather. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Norse word began to take over. People in the north of England started to say sky instead of heophon. The old word heophon did not disappear, but it retreated. It became more specialized. It became heaven, the place you go when you die. It lost its job as the everyday word for the thing you see when you look up. The old word for cloud, wolsen, also began to fade, replaced by the new word cloud, which itself might have been influenced by the Old English word clod, meaning a rock or a hill, because clouds can look like rocky masses in the sky. It is a confusing picture, but what is clear is that the Norse word sky won a spectacular victory. It pushed aside the native English word and took its place. The word sky appears in written English around the year 1200. By the time of Shakespeare, it was the only word anyone would ever think to use. This is perhaps the most subtle theft of all. We stole the Viking word for a cloud and used it to rename the entire sky. We replaced a word of theology with a word of meteorology. It was a quiet revolution in the English language, one that happened in thousands of conversations in fields and farmyards between men like Leif and Cuthbert. And they were just talking about the weather, but in their choice of words, they were reshaping the language and, in a small way, reshaping how English speakers saw the world around them, or at least what they called it.